This is a reading from the 8th chapter of Luke. It happened that one day Jesus got into a boat with his disciples and said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side of the lake." So they set out, and as they sailed, he fell asleep. When a squall of wind came down on the lake, the boat started filling with water, and they began to be in danger. So they went to rouse him, saying, "Master, Master, we are lost." Then, waking up, he rebuked the wind and the rough water, and they subsided, and it became calm. He said to them, "Where is your faith?" They were awestruck and astounded and said to one another, "Who can this be that gives orders even to winds and water, and they obey him?" They came to land in the territory of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. He was stepping ashore when a man from the town who was possessed by demons came to meet him. For a long time the man had worn no clothes and had lived not in a house but in the tombs. Catching sight of Jesus, he cried out, fell at his feet, and shouted out at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you, do not torture me." For Jesus had been telling the unclean spirit to come out of the man. It had seized on him a great many times, and then they used to secure him with cords and fetters to restrain him. But he would always break the bonds and be driven by the demon out into the wilds. Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He said, "Legion," because many demons had entered him. And these begged Jesus not to order them to depart into the deep. Now a large herd of pigs was feeding there on the mountain, and the demons begged him to let them go into these. So he gave them leave. The demons came out of the man and went into the pigs, and the herd charged down the cliff into the lake and was drowned. That passage continues on for another 10 verses or so, but the long and the short of it is that the people of the region, after seeing the man whom we often call the Gerasene demoniac, after seeing him healed, are so freaked out by his healing and also by the drowning of the pigs that they become frightened and ask Jesus to leave them. So he and his disciples sail back across the lake into Galilee. What brings this passage to my mind is a few short paragraphs of commentary on it that I read about 2 hours before learning that the United States had dropped bombs upon Iran, which, no matter what spin the government might want to give to it, seems to me like an act of war. In her commentary on the lectionary reading for this day, which happens to be this passage, Martha Spong wrote, "Matthew, Mark, and Luke all offer us a version of this tale told in Luke 8:26 through 39, and I am struck by the pertinence it has for us today. What does it tell us about Jesus? And what does it tell us about ourselves? Jesus takes off for the other side of the Sea of Galilee with his disciples, landing in Gentile territory. They are already wound up by surviving a storm on the way, and I can't help identifying with them and wondering how they took in the events that followed. As soon as Jesus steps on shore, he is greeted by a naked man who has been living among the tombs. This "are you kidding me" moment feels very familiar in 2025. I had never looked at the story from the perspective of the disciples just stepping onto the shore, but what she says rings true. This is very much like the moment we are living in. And my response to the bombs last night was much the same. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Somehow we are not living with enough chaos and violence and hatred being turned up within our own boundaries that we feel like we have to spread it elsewhere and wait for it to be turned back on us from across the oceans? Are you kidding me? And I wondered how to even grapple with those feelings, that sense of both despair, and powerlessness. And it occurred to me that if nothing else, the times we are living in call for a strong and determined prayer life. So for a little while, I'm going to be more explicit and explanatory about how I believe prayer works than I usually am. And the reason I don't usually go very deeply into how prayer works, especially the prayers we pray for others, which the church calls intercessory prayer. The reason I don't usually go very deeply into how prayer works is because I may be in disagreement with some of you about the way I envision God. Now, not Jesus, but the church from, say, the 500s or 600s through, well, the present day for many people. But again, I say not for Jesus. He is clear about this. The church has made three statements about God that, if all three are true, mean that at some level, God accepts and lives with and perhaps sometimes actively promotes what does not seem to be for the well-being of creation. In other words, God accepts and perhaps promotes evil, and certainly seems unwilling to stop it. And these three statements, accepted by the church sometime in the Dark Ages, that, if they are all true, lead to this conclusion are, these are the three statements: God is all-knowing or omniscient. God is all good and intends good for human beings. In other words, omnibenevolent. God is all-powerful, and there is nothing that can restrain God's acting, which we call omnipotence. But if God is all-knowing and all-powerful and evil still occurs, then God cannot be omnibenevolent. Or if God is all-powerful and omnibenevolent, then God cannot be all-knowing. Or if God is all-knowing and omnibenevolent, then God cannot be omnipotent or all-powerful. The school of thinking about God that is called process theology casts its thinking along the third line: that God is omniscient, knows everything, and omnibenevolent, intends all good, but is not omnipotent, not all-powerful. Sometimes, as a joke, other theologians call process theologians children of a lesser God. But that joke is only half true, because they don't include that what limits God's power is not weakness, but the creative power that God has instilled into the creation itself. The cosmos itself has the powers that God has given it, and God either will not or cannot up and up overturn them. That is why process theologians speak of human beings and the rest of creation as co-creators with God of the world as we know it. And the power that God has is the power of influencing the world as we know it to bring it to what it could be, of putting choices in front of people to act for their best good, even in bad situations, of putting choices in front of people so that they can act for the best good of all, even for their enemies in poor situations. Let me give just one simple example of what I'm talking about. One of my friends has a daughter who's 21 years old. She was driving home from work this winter when a car crossed the line and started to head toward her. In that situation, she could have tried to go on through, or she could have veered off the road. She veered off the road, ran into a tree, and damaged the car, but she was okay. That's the kind of choice that God puts in front of us. Either way, it was a bad situation, but she was led to the best choice. That choice that preserved not only her life, but the life of the person in the car driving towards her. War offers similar choices. Should we kill civilians? Should we destroy everything in the area or only military installations? Should we use torture? Should we use rape as a tool of war, which many countries do? Should we be open to diplomacy and diplomatic solutions, or should we strive for complete annihilation of our enemy and their complete surrender? These are all areas in which God is given the world as it is, that is a world at war, and yet even so may try to put in front of warriors options for better choices. But thousands of miles away, what can we do? For our own sanity, for our own sense of faithfulness and involvement in the world which God has asked us to love, our only option may be to pray. The book that taught me how I could conceive of prayer in a process theology world is called In God's Presence by Marjorie Suchocki. And I'm going to read now a couple of passages from her chapter on intercessory prayer, and which she explains both why we need to pray at these times and why God needs us to pray at these times. Remember that in the process theology world, God and creation are inextricably related to one another, and God uses what exists in the world to lead and invite the world into being something better than it currently is. This is what Suchocki means when she frequently talks about God's contextual relationship with the world, that God works with the world as God finds it, and that we human beings are intricately connected in both our thinking and our actions and our emotions and our spirit with changing the world as God finds it. And so she writes, were the God-world relation one where there were absolutely no limitations on God, on God's power, in other words, if God were omnipotent, then the universe would be a place where intercessory prayer would be absolutely unnecessary. But in a God-world relation of interdependence, where the world's power must be taken into account, where God's power is exercised in the form of possibilities that the world has the power to reject, then intercessory prayer is of utmost importance. It's not just that we need to pray, it's that God needs us to do the praying. Our prayers actually make a difference to what God can do. God works with the world as it is. Quite simply, prayer changes the isness of the world. A world where there is specific praying going on is not the same as a world where this praying is not going on. I'll repeat that one part. Prayer changes the isness of the world. Prayer changes what the world is that God can work with. Later on in the chapter, Suchocki writes, God's touch upon our lives often takes the form of a call to us to pray, so that we ourselves become a new opening for God's power in the world. Consider the horrible human penchant to slaughter those whom we do not perceive to be of our own kind. We assume that God does not will the slaughter of people, and that since God receives from every element of the world, God, as well as the slaughtered, experiences the pain of the hatred and its killing power. What can God do against human intransigence? We have long since learned that God is not a Thor, hurling thunderbolts in indignant retaliation. God works against the world's resistance. But when we pray for the well-being of those involved in dreadful bloodshed, even when we do not personally know those peoples, do we not give the God who works interdependently and relationally with creation more to work with? By our active caring exercised through our prayers, have we not to some degree changed the context? Though we are at a distance, though we are relatively insignificant in the politics and hatreds of amassed power, though we have no control over foreign powers, yet we are not helpless. For God wills well-being. It is a present force toward what forms of well-being are possible in any situation, even in the horror of military madness. When we pray, we open ourselves to God's will toward well-being. The direct resistance toward well-being that God deals with in any strife is countered by our own openness toward that specific well-being. In a relational world, our caring directed towards others turns us into part of the context within which God works towards the other's good. Even though we are at a distance, our prayers change what is possible. For God is never at a distance. She goes on to say that this prayer may not only change the context within which God works, but it might turn out to have a direct call on us for our own action. And she tells the story of having just become the dean of Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., was just arranging her office when the faculty voted, and this was during the time of apartheid, the faculty voted to hold a protest upon the steps of the South African embassy against apartheid. And she thought this would be meaningless. She thought that it might be possible that she and the faculty would get arrested, but that whatever terrors awaited them were simply inconveniences in comparison to the real protests, as she thought, going on in South Africa, where people could be killed for protesting. She thought it was a meaningless, insignificant gesture, but the faculty had voted and she was their dean. So she was going to have to go. They would go to the South African embassy, they would present their petitions to end apartheid, they would say some prayers, and they would leave. Then she found out that, to her horror, because she was the dean, she was the leader of the protest, and she was the one who had to walk up the stairs and knock on the door and hand in the petition. And they said their prayers, and they were arrested, and several hours later they were let go. And she went back to her office and sat there somewhat grumpily, thinking this was just meaningless. It meant nothing. There is so much that's needed in South Africa, and we've done our little sign waving, and so what? So I want to read you this part. "5 months later, the letter came. As dean, I was the one to receive it. Tears flowed down my cheeks as I read the letter from a pastor in South Africa thanking us at Wesley Theological Seminary for what we had done. He had read our protest, he said, and shared it with his congregation, and he could not say what courage it had given them to know that we too stood with them. It gave them a new boldness in their efforts," he said, as he thanked us in the name of God. And I wept. The easiness of our prayers for these unknown people had become the hardness of action, even though that action was indeed a very tiny and insignificant part of the full drama of South Africa. But by the grace of God, it did become a part of it. Our actions were but a drop when an ocean was needed, but we were called to be that drop. And we became part of a mighty ocean. These years later, I see and wonder the ultimate fruit of all that has happened in that country of miracles. By the faithfulness of God, prayer has played a part in the empowerment of a people, the raising up of leaders, and some degree of resolution in the struggle toward a more just government. Be careful for what you pray, for God may use you in addressing those things for which you pray, even though you are at a distance. Prayer creates a channel in the world through which God can unleash God's will toward well-being. Prayer puts you in the way of the channel, and you will become a part of God's rolling waters. I myself do not see any solutions for what we have unleashed in the world. And for that reason, and because I seem to myself so powerless, I need prayer as something that I can do to calm myself, but I am also convinced that my intercessory prayer can be part of bringing about a better outcome. I think this is true for all of us. Suchocki says that very often we do not need to be specific in our prayer. We may stop ourselves because we say we don't know what is needed, but in fact, perhaps the best thing we can pray for is that for God's wish for well-being to be made manifest, to pray for the well-being of everyone involved in the situation, to pray for the well-being of our world. We don't specifically have to say what that well-being looks like for us if we don't know. If we have ideas, we can say them. But the most important thing to help God in working with the world as it is to bring it to what it can be is to participate with God's desire through prayer as best we can.